Dust to velvets. The scribe's inheritance, from Karachi's streets to Oxford's hall, unveiling a lost legacy of art and survival. By Sirat-ul-Uruj Abro. Chapter 2. The Sun-Baked Home. Naira offered Peter Hill a faint, calculating smile, acknowledging the profound truth he sought. My story, Mr. Hill, is not one of a fixed location or ancestral property, she began, her tone carrying the weight of permanent eviction. In fact, we never owned a house in Pakistan. My father was a man who failed constantly, though with good intentions, which meant we were economically very down. The concept of stability was foreign to us. We were a family defined by boxes and transit. Every few months, or at most every year, we would shift from one rental house to another, always just ahead of the landlord, always trading down for something smaller, cheaper, and often dustier. My childhood wasn't measured in birthdays or holidays, but in the number of times I had to repack the few belongings we possessed. Home was never a place, it was merely a temporary shelter that constantly reminded me we were disposable. The constant migration was a corrosive stressor for Naira's mother, but her frustration was twofold. It wasn't just the sheer instability of their existence, it was the useless baggage they insisted on carrying with them. To Naira's mother, the family possessions were not history, they were dead weight. There were trunks full of old, faded cloth, stacks of brittle books no one read, and small decorative objects like the naqashi boxes and that tarnished brass kalam. Her father and grandfather revered these items as mementos, but in the mother's practical, lower-middle-class view, they were just dust-collecting junk, ancient belongings with zero market value that only made the exhausting process of moving heavier and more humiliating. That this worthless inventory was what kept them perpetually poor, consuming space and energy without providing a single rupee, was the source of her bitterest anger. Whenever Naira's mother, or even young Naira herself, suggested leaving the junk behind, or worse, selling it to a recycler for weight, her father would grow immediately angry, sometimes aggressive. He protected those dusty objects with a disproportionate ferocity, insisting they were all that was left of a forgotten past. He defended the legacy of the items while remaining tragically blind to the simple fact that their bulk consumed space, energy, and money, ensuring the family's perpetual struggle continued beneath the weight of sentimental clutter. The summons came, as it always did, with crushing predictability. When Naira was 13, the failure to pay rent once again ejected them from their temporary shelter. This move was worse than the others. The shame was heavier, the new neighbourhood rougher, and the exhausting process of packing felt endless. Everything the family owned had to be hauled out, and nothing weighed more on Naira's spirit than the father's bulky, ancient possessions. The trunks of forgotten cloth, the brittle books, and the heavy naqashi boxes, all of the useless junk her mother despised, had to be lifted, sweated over, and loaded onto the rickety hired vehicle. They were carrying the weight of a history they didn't know they owned, cursed by the sheer physical burden of these worthless objects that everyone in the family, except her father, desperately wished they could abandon on the side of the road. Upon finally arriving at the new, cheaper rental, a sun-baked concrete box in a rougher mohalla, the immediate task was cramming their lives inside. Naira was the third in a row of 4 siblings. Her elder brother, 20 years old and burdened with the family's expectations, was already beginning to look for work. Her older sister was focused on completing her studies. Naira, at 13, was sandwiched between the demands of the elders and the innocence of her much younger brother, whose mere presence sometimes offered the only fleeting small sign of relief for their exhausted parents.
The only saving grace of the entire miserable property was a small, dusty storeroom at the back. It was barely more than a closet, but it was enough to finally offload the heavy, useless baggage, the trunks, the old books, and the naqashi boxes. The family, weary from the move, felt a collective sigh of relief as the clutter that symbolized their financial failure was sealed away behind a rickety wooden door. The private office was quiet. Naira's voice, though low and steady, had filled the room with the raw heat and shame of that distant Karachi Maholla. She had drawn the reporter, Peter Hill, not just to a location, but to a feeling, the exhausting, soul-crushing weight of poverty, disguised as sentimental pride. She paused, letting the silence hold the image of the dusty storeroom where all that history and all their financial ruin was sealed away. Peter Hill nodded slowly, his observant eyes processing the pain behind the elegantly composed facade. He had the full context now, the economic instability, the generational attachment to the junk, and the mother's practical, desperate anger. He understood the problem. Now he needed the solution. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the rosewood desk. "You've explained the burden, Miss Sarwar, the trash that kept your family poor. But that is only half the story. The rest of the Sarwar collection is here, in London, valued in the billions. What precisely was the incident that led you, the 13-year-old girl, to suddenly see that familial trash, that worthless inventory, as a treasure worth risking everything for?"